and welcome back to the channel. So if you watched last week's video, you know that my primary travel lens on my Rocky Mountain road trip was the 7-14mm F2.8 Pro. So today I'm going to share with you how I found using the 7-14mm as my primary travel lens went. Now typically when I go traveling, the 12-40 is my primary travel lens. So I am going to be comparing the 7-14mm to the 12-40, but this isn't a true comparison video because I didn't equally test both on this trip. So without further ado, let's get into it. So why did I make the 7-14mm my primary travel lens on this trip? So typically when we go traveling, like I said, the 12-40mm is my primary travel lens, and it's because I put a heavier emphasis on photographing a trip, and my style of photographing a trip is taking more of a documentary approach. So I like getting photos that document, where we are, what we're doing, genuine moments of the trip. So I get a mix of photos of like portraits, landscapes, detail, food, kind of a mix of photos, and so the 12-40 is just perfect for all of that. But on this trip, I was putting a heavier focus on videography, so doing more vlogging of the trip, getting more video footage of what we're doing and stuff like that, and I was concerned that the 12mm on the 12-40 wasn't going to be wide enough on my Olympus camera because of the crop factor. So that's why I decided to give the 7-14mm a go at being my primary travel lens. So to get some basic details of the lens out of the way. So the 7-14mm maximum aperture is f2.8. Its minimum is f22. The length of this lens is 4.17 inches long and 3.11 inches wide and weighs 1.18 pounds. So we'll start with some of the pros of using this lens. So one of the things that I really liked about this lens was that it was great in low light situations. So because the maximum aperture of this guy is f2.8, during one of the activities, we were in a pretty dark room, and this lens did a phenomenal job in capturing both photo and video. This lens was also really great for travel videography and vlogging. I loved this lens for video. I never had to worry that this lens wasn't going to be wide enough, that I wasn't capturing enough of the environment, and I actually found for the most part the distortion or that wide angle feel never really came through in the video. There were definitely times where depending on the camera angle it would come through, but for the most part it was actually really manageable. And so I'm about halfway through editing all of the footage from that Rocky Mountain road trip, and I'm just loving how the video is turning out. This lens was also great for certain landscapes and travel photography. So I would say like landscapes, environmental portraits, and interior photos were really good on this lens, and I'll pop up on the screen a series of photos that I took using the 7-14mm. As well, with all of Olympus's gear, not just limited to the 7-14mm, is its weatherproofing system. So I've talked about this so many times in so many videos, but I love how Olympus's gear is weatherproofed. So on 2 of the days when we were traveling, we had really bad weather. On the first day, it was just cold, and on the third day, we had like a snowstorm in Calgary. So it was like a really slushy, wet snow that came down, and I was wearing my camera gear for the most part of this trip, and so the lens and my camera gear was subjected to the elements a little bit more, but I honestly wasn't too worried about it because I know Olympus just makes really great weatherproofed systems. Some minor things too about this lens that I like is, one, it doesn't get any longer when you use it at 7mm or 14mm, which is just a nice feature to have. As well, I love the lens cap of the 7-14. So again, because of that dome shape of the lens, it doesn't have like a flat lens cap that goes on it. This lens cap is actually a little bit wider, and that it has to go over top of the lens, and so I just really like it because it makes putting it on and off really easy, and you're not like fumbling with it. To get to some of the cons of using this lens, I would say that the biggest con with the 7-14 is just that it's trickier to use for everyday travel photography, in the sense again of how I like to photograph and document a trip. And I say trickier because when I first saw all of the photos that I took on the 7-14mm, I didn't really care for them because I really found that the distortion came through of using a wide angle lens, especially in tight spaces. But then after I spent some time editing the photos, I really found I was able to kind of lessen the distortion. So I think when you're taking the photos and editing them, you just have to work a little bit harder to de-emphasize that wide angle feel. So again, I'll put up some like raw and after edited ones just so you can see what I mean. But you just have to work a little bit harder, and that this lens is just a little bit more trickier to use for everyday travel photography. Now, I can't completely fault using the 7-14mm completely. Like I said, typically when I travel, I use the 12-40mm, and so I have a lot more practice using the 12-40mm than I do with the 7-14. This is the first trip that I brought the 7-14 specifically to use primarily for travel photography, as well switching from photo to video constantly, which was tricky in itself. So I think with a little bit more practice, the 7-14 would become like less tricky over time. The other thing about the 7-14mm is that it's just not as versatile for travel photography. So versatility is really important to me in travel photography. And with the 12-40, you can get a lot of different kinds of photos with this. You can do landscapes, portraits, wildlife to a degree, food. It's just a really versatile and beautiful lens. And the 7-14 just isn't as versatile. So on one of the days, I wanted to get some nice medium close-up shots of the mountains that were surrounding us in Canmore, and I ended up switching to the 12-40 because it's a little bit more versatile and I was able to get a little bit closer to the mountain, because the 7-14 does make objects appear farther than they actually are. And then when we were also at the UNESCO Wolf Dog Sanctuary, I ended up switching to the 12-40 because again, it's a little bit more versatile for that kind of photography. The 7-14mm is also just a little bit longer and heavier. So the 7-14, like we covered, it is 1.18 pounds and it's 4.17 inches long, versus the 12-40 is 0.84 pounds, I think, and 3.3 inches long. So the 7-14 is just a little bit longer and heavier, and it's not a huge difference, but when you are trying to go as compact and lightweight as possible, the little bit of ounces, the little bit of millimeters do make a difference. And lastly, because of the dome shape of the 7-14mm, you can't put a screw-on filter on this guy. So I covered it in my original 7-14mm video, and that you can't put a screw-on filter on this guy. And so it does make me a little wary when I'm traveling around with it, because with my 12-40, my 40-150, they all have like just a filter to kind of add extra protection to the lens. And I just can't do that with the 7-14mm. So if I fell on a trip, this lens was not going to be good for my camera gear. And guess what? I did actually end up falling on this trip because of that really snowy day in Calgary. The roads were really slippery and I ended up falling on the street. But because I was trying to protect my pregnant belly and the camera, I ended up rotating mid-fall, and so I fell on like my side / my back. So I was able to protect my camera gear and my belly, but typically, like, you know, not being able to put a screw-on filter onto the lens just kind of makes me a little bit weary, because you can't just add that little extra protection to the lens. So in conclusion, there's definitely some pros and cons with using the 7-14mm as a primary travel lens. Again, this is in the way that I like to do travel photography and videography. I probably wouldn't ever go on a trip just with the 7-14mm, doing like a one lens type of a situation, like I would with the 12-40mm, because I do think the 12-40 is still a lot more versatile. I gotta say, when it comes to travel photography, 12 to 40 is still my favorite, but when it comes to like vlogging and videography, the 7 to 14 millimeter does a really phenomenal job. I am really curious about the 8 to 25 millimeter that Olympus came out with earlier this year, because you get the wide angle of an 8 millimeter, but you also get the focal length of a 50 millimeter. So I'm really curious about the two, but let me know down in the comments if you have a favorite lens for travel videography and photography, or if you have the 8 to 25 millimeter and how you like it. I hope you enjoyed today's video and found it helpful. If you did, then hit that like button below and subscribe. Maybe buy me a cup of coffee, and I'll see you in the next video.